I used to think our problem was religion.
Famous communists saying that religion is the opiate of the masses. Is that true?
How religion could make you cling to false ideology, and how these false ideologies could set a people back and even prevent them from evolving, because their judgment and reasoning had been clouded by the walls of religion, if not tamed. But I was very wrong. Religion wasn't really the problem. Perhaps the real problem was our leaders, men and women who have been corrupted by power and consumed by greed. People who only care about satisfying their expensive and unending desires, and have always failed to develop this land. Eventually, I realized that I wasn't even right still, at least not totally. This disaster had not come only from our leaders, there was more. Regardless, I feel so sad. We have so much potential and individual brilliance, but as a people we have failed to thrive. I wonder if it has always been this way. I wonder if it will ever change. Why is the poverty rate highest here? Why is life expectancy lowest here? Why is education lowest here? Why is insecurity highest here? Why do we excel in the worst indices and perform worst in the best indices? Why do we have so much and yet wait on others to feed us from our own treasures? Why are we eager to travel out to a place we can build here and call home? Why are we slow to evolve? Are we really slow to evolve? Why is Africa backwards? Or are we not? If you care, then you will find not only the problems in this video but also the solutions, because this is why Africa is still backwards. If you ask the average common person why Africa is undeveloped, you'd probably hear suggestions concerned with corruption, bad leadership, poor infrastructure, poor education, and even incompetence. But if you keep asking and going deeper, if you keep trying to connect the dots, you realize that all of these stem from a much complex problem, as I'll be showing you. There is a root denominator, a hidden culprit that very few people are talking about, and that is what I want us to explore together. Well, everything really started here, when African colonies first gained independence from the European powers and that of the West. The Second World War was just over, and the superpowers and colonizers like the Americans, the Russians, the French had their resources depleted. They had been so drained from the losses incurred during the war, and so they no longer had the capacity to maintain the control of their colonies, most of which were African territories. Soon, these African colonies began to realize that this was a perfect time to strike back while their colonizers were at their weakest. This was the perfect time to fight for their independence. Interestingly, Ghana was the first colony to fight, and it worked. They gained their independence on March 6, 1957. Eventually, other African countries followed suit, and today almost every African country is independent. This is the story we have been told, but here lies the first problem. The story is a lie. At least it's not completely true. It's a mirage. Africa never gained independence. Most African nations have never been sovereign. The West did not just let Africa go after so many years of establishing imperialism in Africa. In fact, most African nations are still colonized today. Nigeria, Ghana, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Zimbabwe, South Africa, we are all not sovereign. I know you can beat your chest and swear that your country is independent, and you very well remember the exact date of independence. This has to just be some wasteful conspiracy by a nobody. Well, I wish you were right, but you are not. The reality is that many African countries have no true sovereignty. More so, this isn't the type of colonialism that you're familiar with. You know, the use of force, such as military conquest or the threat of force, establishing colonies and the imposition of a new culture and way of life on the colonized people. This is different. This is more silent. but way more efficient.
It's a story we have seen many times before, different settings, but the same strategy: a struggling borrower, a big loan, and some ruthless and secretive terms of agreement. We call this a debt trap.
Its military presence in Africa, but it's not being completely open about its plans.
So the African Union Peace and Security Council says it's concerned about the growing number of African governments hosting foreign military bases on the continent. Around 13 foreign countries have a military presence in Africa.
It is something we commonly like to call neocolonialism. And nothing will ever change if we don't address and fix this. I mean, nothing. What is neocolonialism? Neocolonialism is the continued economic and political domination of former colonies by their former colonizers or other developed countries. It is a modern form of imperialism that manifests itself through economic policies and practices that maintain the former colonies' dependence on the developed countries. The idea is that a country remains dependent and you sabotage their ability to develop independently. Most African countries exist in this system specifically designed to keep them dependent and at the lower end. Of course, I'm burning to go into details now, and I hope that somehow you won't find the information I'm about to share with you too shocking to believe. Because it is actually true. After gaining independence, many African countries were left with weak institutions, a lack of infrastructure, and little economic development, as well as economies that were heavily dependent on primary commodity exports. These countries were unable to build the institutions and infrastructure that would let them grow economically. In addition, there was the Cold War, a war that was ongoing between America and the Soviet Union. The Cold War also created a global environment that made it difficult for many African countries to thrive just by themselves. It was going to be difficult for these newly independent countries to thrive on their own. It was possible, very possible, but it would require a lot of work and maybe some support. By the corner, the European powers were waiting. They had been flourishing and extracting so much wealth from the African continent during the colonial era, and they weren't about to let that change. So they came into the picture. They proposed to help the newly independent African states. They proposed to offer financial help as a show of goodwill. With a few negotiations and contemplations, African leaders began to accept this offer. I mean, why would they refuse money, free money, and financial aid when they needed it most, right? Wrong. This was a problem, particularly because the help was not offered in good spirit. There were strings attached. Many of our past leaders began to borrow large amounts of money from the Western banks and international organizations, such as the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, to finance developments of projects and other initiatives. Because of how much they were encouraged to do so, it turns out they borrowed too much. The loans were difficult to pay back. This slowly made them dependent on the former colonizers for help, especially debt relief. But this was one side of the coin. During the colonial era, African farmers were forced to grow cash crops such as cocoa and coffee instead of food crops. What all of this did was that it prevented Africa from learning to develop its own industries. Instead, they adapted to importing finished products from Europe. So, as newly independent states, we had to import most of what we would need, at least for the meantime, till we slowly grow and build our own industries. We did not have the money, but we had natural resources, the abundance of it. So the idea was to trade these natural resources for money or finished products till we can stand on our feet and even begin to export finished products like the others. This was not a bad plan, but it was not going to happen. Why? The West could not let it happen. They heavily relied on this system, so they tried to reinforce it. We were desperate, and they used that to their advantage. While trading with us, they insisted on unfair trade agreements that favored them. A solid example is that many African countries were exporting raw materials to the European Union at low prices while importing finished goods at high prices. We are forced to use their currency during trade. The first use of the colonial currency had several negative impacts on the African economy. Firstly, the exchange rate was fixed, meaning that African countries could not determine the exchange rate of their currencies. This fixed exchange rate favored the European countries because it made African products cheaper and easier to purchase. However, African countries received less value for their products in the international markets. This was not a system that would work for us in any way. It would never let us flourish at that time. But for some reason, we allowed it, we accommodated it, especially as we were already indebted. But perhaps the worst yet were some economic policies imposed on African countries by international financial institutions, especially during the 1980s and 1990s. These economic policies were called Structural Adjustment Programs, SAP. The West said that these policies would help arrest economic crisis plaguing Africa. But again, it was a trap. At that time, if you wanted to receive loans or any form of financial assistance or even partake in international trading with Europe, the condition was that you must accept the SAP. Eventually, it turned out that the SAP did more harm than good and destabilized Africa even further. You should realize that this is not just history, this is our present reality. Many African countries are still in debt traps. Today we are still trading with unfair trade agreements and being subjected to unfair and diabolic economic policies. By now you should have begun to see the pattern. We are choked with economic policies and relationships that would never let us grow, except these economic ties are broken.
What is your message to Western human rights groups, to President Obama,
Respect,
to lesbian, gay, bisexual and transgender people?
Respect African societies and their values. If you don't agree, you just keep quiet. Let's manage our society the way we see. If we are wrong, we shall find out by ourselves. Just the way we don't interfere with yours.
Western countries have always used their economic and financial power to influence and control the politics of African nations. They do this in many ways, including supporting authoritarian regimes that are friendly to the West and their interests, or funding opposition groups that promote Western-style democracy. Basically, the West will try as much as possible to overthrow a democratically elected government and install puppet regimes that serve the interests of the West and Europe. One of such examples is the overthrow of Patrice Lumumba, the democratically elected Prime Minister of Congo in 1960. Lumumba was a leftist leader who advocated for the nationalization of Congo's resources and the expulsion of Belgian colonizers. However, the West feared that his policies would threaten their economic interests, so they supported a military coup that removed him from power and installed a puppet government led by Mobutu Sese Seko, who served the Western interest for decades. Another example is the overthrow of Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana in 1966. Nkrumah was a Pan-Africanist who advocated for the unification of African countries and the establishment of a socialist government in China. However, his policies threatened the Western economic interests, so the CIA supported a military coup that removed him from power. During the 2011 presidential election in Ivory Coast, the West supported Alassane Ouattara, who was seen as more friendly to Western interests, over incumbent Laurent Gbagbo. The West backed Ouattara despite evidence of electoral fraud, and French and UN forces ultimately intervened militarily to install Ouattara as president. Popularly, 2011, NATO forces intervened in the Libyan civil war, leading to the removal of Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi. While the intervention was framed as an humanitarian mission, many experts argue that it was motivated by Western countries' desire to gain control of Libya oil reserves. The resulting power vacuum in Libya led to chaos and instability, which continues to this day. All of this shows that the West still influences African politics significantly, and that is why their economic impositions on us have stood this long. This way, we would never evolve fully and develop properly. Of course, I'm not saying that the West is the cause of all of our problems. We have a lot of problems that originate from us, not external factors, especially our bad and incompetent leaders, corrupt people at the top. However, we are not the only ones with corrupt leaders. Vladimir Putin, the Russian president, the China president, the North Korean president, all of these people, even Joe Biden, have all been associated with extreme corruption. Corruption is not just the problem. The problem is not that we don't have brilliant minds or we are not good enough to innovate and create. We are just trapped in a self-reinforcing system that plagues development. Unlike many other countries, we have to address this problem directly if we want to see change. I'm going to end this video by suggesting ways we can break out of neocolonialism in my own little way of thinking. But before that, I want to humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel, like the video, and most importantly, share this video as much as you can so that others can learn too. Also feel free to drop your thoughts and your opinions in the comment section. We can always talk. Alright, back to the video. It all starts from you as an individual. I think our first problem is that we lack self-pride. African people would usually want to identify as someone else, a false identity. Somehow we have not learned to be proud of our identity, the color of our skin, the texture of our hair, the way we speak, our culture, our tradition. These inevitably affect how we view ourselves on the world stage, regarding others as more superior or more capable, and that is very wrong. The reality is that we are actually one of the most capable, the most intelligent, and most creative set of people. But many don't realize this. This lack of self-pride can even deter our passion for our land and our motivation to invest here. Many of us don't love our nation, and that is why we can just settle for less with whatever is imposed on us. The average American is way more patriotic, more proud of their identity, and more willing to fight for that cause than the average African. If we evolve from this phase, a lot will change, a whole lot. This is how revolution is bettered, on the wings of patriotism. The second most important thing is to promote African unity. I can't overemphasize on this. As a people, as a continent, Africa is not united. African countries need to come together and form a united front to resist neocolonialism. We need to be willing to invest in each other and trade with each other, have more international trade agreements with each other than outside the continent whenever possible. This can be achieved through regional integration such as the African Continental Free Trade Arena, which is aimed at promoting trade between African countries. Even so, a more united Africa can negotiate better deals with foreign nations and international organizations. Lastly, education. Information, particularly about neocolonialism. Spreading information about this system and its consequences can be a powerful tool in helping Africans fight it. This can help to build a sense of solidarity and a shared understanding of the problems that need to be addressed. When people become more aware of colonialism, they may become more resistant to its influence. We can now intentionally advocate for policies that would cripple the influence of external powers on us. There is a lot to say. The issue of neocolonialism is such a very wide topic and I can't possibly cover everything in this single video. I hope this video proved valuable to you. I have to thank you for staying to the very end of the video. See you soon, my friends.